Lady, you don't know us. Close that door before one of us decides to do something you'll regret. The man on Evelyn Carter's porch was twice her size, snow-caked in his beard, a chain hanging from his belt. Behind him, 99 more shadows shivered in the dark. Any sane woman would have slammed the door and called the sheriff. Evelyn Carter, 72, widowed alone, looked the giant dead in the eye and said the words that would change an entire town forever. Son, the only thing that I'm going to regret is letting good men freeze on my doorstep. Now get inside. Before we go on, if you believe one act of kindness can still change the world, hit that subscribe button and stay with me to the very end of this story, because what happens the next morning will leave you speechless. And do me a favor, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see just how far Evelyn's story has traveled tonight. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the old door in its frame. Evelyn Carter didn't move at first. She stood in the narrow hallway of the farmhouse she'd shared with Harold for 41 years, one hand pressed flat against the wall, listening. The wind outside had been screaming since noon. The radio had warned everybody in the county to stay home, stay warm, stay put. The worst blizzard Montana had seen in 30 years, the man on the AM station had said, and his voice had cracked a little when he said it. Nobody knocks on a door at 11 o'clock at night in the middle of a storm like this. Not unless something has gone terribly wrong. All right, she muttered, mostly to steady herself. I'm coming. She flicked on the porch light. Through the frosted glass of the door, she saw shapes. Big ones, more than one. Her heart did something painful in her chest, and for a half second the old fear rose up me. Fear every woman who lives alone carries somewhere deep, the fear her daughter Sarah called her about every Sunday. Mom, you really shouldn't be out there by yourself. Anybody could come up that road and you'd have no one. She opened the door anyway. The cold hit her, first a wall of it, and then the sight of him. A mountain of a man, leather jacket frozen stiff, a gray beard packed with ice eyes red from the wind. Behind him, stretching back into the swirling white, she could make out more men, dozens of them, hunched against the storm, stamping their boots, slapping their arms. Ma'am, the big man said, and his voice was hoarse, almost gone. I'm real sorry to bother you. We got caught out on the highway. Whole stretch of roads shut down. Our bikes are there, done, buried. We've been walking near 2 hours looking for a light. Yours is the only one for miles. Evelyn looked past him at the others. She counted the way she always counted things, an old habit from her years teaching grade school. She lost count somewhere past 40. How many of you are there? She asked. The man hesitated. 100, give or take. We're a riding club. Was supposed to make it to Billings by dark. He swallowed. Look, I know how this looks. 100 bikers showing up at at a lady's door in the middle of the night. I get it. You don't have to let us in. We just some of the younger guys. They're not dressed for this. We got a kid back there, 19, his lips are turning blue. I'm scared, ma'am. I'm scared we're gonna lose somebody tonight if we don't get out of this wind. That was when he said it, the thing about regret, the warning. The words a man says when he's trying to give a frightened woman an easy way out. Close that door before one of us decides to do something you'll regret. And that was when Evelyn Carter decided. She didn't decide with her head. Her head was screaming at her in Sarah's voice, in Harold's voice, in the voice of every neighbor who'd ever told her this town wasn't what it used to be. She decided with the part of her that had spent 40 years teaching other people's children, the part that had sat with Harold every night for 11 months, while the cancer took him piece by piece, the part that knew exactly what it felt like to be cold and alone and praying anybody would open a door. Son, as she said, the only thing I'm going to regret is letting good men freeze on my doorstep. Now get inside, all of you. The barn's heated. Harold put a wood stove in there years back. And whoever that blue-lipped boy is, you bring him to my kitchen right now. The big man stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. Ma'am, you don't understand. There's 100 of us. We can't just... I can count, young man, Evelyn said, and there was iron under the warmth. Now the voice that had quieted 33rd graders for 40 years. I taught school in this county longer than you've been alive. I know exactly how many of you there are, and I know exactly how cold it is, and I am telling you to bring that boy inside before I have to come out there and drag him in myself. Do I look like I'm in any condition to do that? Something broke across the big man's frozen face. It might have been a laugh. It might have been the first warm thing he'd felt in 2 hours. No, ma'am, he said quietly. You do not. He turned and bellowed into the storm. Danny, get the kid up here, move. The next 20 minutes were chaos, the good kind, the kind Evelyn hadn't felt in her house since the grandchildren stopped coming. Men poured through her door, stamping snow, ducking their heads, murmuring thank you, ma'am, and bless you, ma'am, and I'm sorry about the mess, ma'am, in voices that didn't match their size or their tattoos or the patches on their jackets. The big man, he told her his name was Jack Morrison, and he was the president of the club, directed half of them out to the barn, and kept the worst off ones in the house. The boy with the blue lips was named Tyler. 19 years old, skinny as a fence post, and shaking so hard his teeth clattered. Evelyn took one look at him and pointed at the chair closest to the wood stove. Sit, she ordered. Jack, get his boots off. Those socks are soaked through. Frostbite starts in the toes. Tyler, honey, can you feel your feet? No, not really, ma'am, the boy chattered. Then we've got work to do. She was already moving, pulling a kettle to the stovetop, dragging a stack of Harold's old wool blankets out of the hall closet. Not too hot now. You don't warm a frozen man up. Fast you warm him up slow or you'll do more harm than good. My Harold was a paramedic for 20 years before his knees gave out. I learned a thing or two. And a heavy-set man near the door bawled. A long white scar down one cheek spoke up. You sure know what you're doing, ma'am. Most folks would have panicked. Most folks haven't watched somebody they love nearly die in their arms, Evelyn said, not turning around. After that, 100 frozen bikers in your living room isn't the scariest thing in the world. The room went quiet for a moment. Then somebody laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and then they were all laughing, the tension breaking like ice off a roof, and Evelyn smiled to herself as she poured the first mug of cocoa. She would tell people later that the laugh was the moment she stopped being afraid. But the bikers, they would tell people something different. They'd say the moment they knew this old woman was something they'd never seen before was a little while after that when she did the thing nobody expected. She started learning their names, not nodding at them, not calling them son or young man the way most people did with men who looked like them. She went around the room, mug by mug, blanket by blanket, and she asked, "What's your name, sweetheart?" Marcus, ma'am." "Marcus, and where are you from, Marcus?" "Cleveland, originally Ohio." "Ohio, you're a long way from home. What do you do back in Cleveland?" And Marcus, 6'4", 300 pounds, arms covered in ink, looked down at the floor like a shy boy and said, I fix HVAC systems, heating and cooling. Got my own little business. 2 trucks. 2 trucks, Evelyn said warmly. Your mama must be proud. And Marcus's eyes did something, then went bright and wet, and he had to clear his throat twice before he said, "She passed last spring, ma'am, but yeah, she was." Evelyn put her small hand on his enormous forearm. "Then I'm sure she still is," she said. "Mamas don't stop being proud just because they're not here to say so." Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. He just nodded and looked away. And Jack Morrison, watching from across the room, felt something twist in his own chest that he hadn't felt in a long, long time. These men were used to being feared. They were used to mothers pulling children closer in parking lots, used to waitresses who wouldn't quite meet their eyes, used to the click of car door locks when they pulled up to a stoplight. They'd built a whole brotherhood, partly because the rest of the world had decided what they were before they ever opened their mouths. And here was a 72-year-old widow alone in a farmhouse with 100 strangers asking about their mothers. Jack made his way over to the stove where Evelyn was checking on Tyler's feet. The color was coming back. The boy had stopped shaking. "Ma'am," Jack said quietly so the others couldn't hear, "I need to ask you something and I want you to be honest with me." "All right. Aren't you scared even a little 100 men you never met? No husband. Nearest neighbor's what, a mile down the road, and the phones are probably down with the storm." He shook his head. "My own sister wouldn't let us in. We stopped at her place outside Bozeman last summer and she made us eat in the yard. Her own brother." He looked at her and his voice dropped lower. "So I gotta ask, why us? Why ain't you scared of us?" Evelyn straightened up slowly, one hand on her lower back, and looked at this huge, frightening man with the gray beard and the cold eyes that weren't cold at all when you looked close enough. "Can I tell you a secret, Jack?" "Yes, ma'am." "I am scared," she said. "I've been scared for 2 years. Ever since Harold passed, I've been scared every single night in this house. Scared of the dark, scared of the quiet, scared of falling and nobody finding me for a week. Scared I'd just fade out all alone and nobody would notice till the mail piled up." She gave a small, sad smile. "You want to know the truth? You boys knocking on my door tonight is the least scared I've felt in 2 years. Because for the first time in a long time, somebody needs me. Do you have any idea what that's worth to an old woman who'd started to think she was done being any use to anybody? Jack Morrison, a man who hadn't cried since his father's funeral 19 years ago, had to turn away and pretend to check on Tyler. No, ma'am, he said thickly. I guess I don't. Well, Evelyn patted his shoulder or as high up as she could reach. Now you do. Now go on and tell those boys in the barn there's soup coming. Nobody freezes on my watch. The night unrolled hour by hour after that, and the farmhouse filled up with something it hadn't held in years. Voices, laughter, the smell of food, the warm chaos of life. Evelyn cooked. Lord, did she cook. She emptied her pantry into a stock pot the size of a wash tub, the big one she only ever pulled out for church potlucks, and she made soup enough to feed an army, which is more or less what she had. The men took turns. They rotated in from the barn in shifts, so everybody got a warm meal and a turn by the stove. And they were so polite about it, so careful with her things, that she finally had to scold them. Stop tiptoeing around my house like you're going to break it, she said. It's already broken. Sit down and eat. That got a laugh too. But the heavy-set man with the scar, his name was Big Pete, and he'd been a Marine 2 tours before the bikes, he didn't laugh. He looked around the kitchen with a careful eye the way a man looks at a thing he understands, and he saw what Evelyn hadn't wanted any of them to see. He saw the bucket in the corner positioned just so catching the slow drip from a brown stain spreading across the ceiling. He saw the duct tape wrapped around the base of the wood stove's pipe. He saw the window in the back room that had been covered with plastic sheeting and a board because the glass was cracked clean through. He saw the thermostat on the wall set to 58 degrees. 58 in a Montana blizzard, and he understood the way you understand a thing in your gut before your head catches up, that this woman wasn't keeping it that cold because she liked it cold. She was keeping it that cold because she couldn't afford to keep it warm. Big Pete didn't say anything. He just caught Jack's eye across the room and gave a small nod toward the bucket, toward the ceiling, toward the taped-up stove. And Jack looked, and Jack saw it too. The woman who was feeding 100 strangers out of an emptying pantry, who was wrapping them in her dead husband's blankets, who was learning their names and asking about their mothers, she was, Jack realized with a slow, cold horror, in worse shape than any of them. She'd opened her home to keep them from freezing, and she was barely keeping herself warm. Jack pulled Big Pete and Marcus and a couple of the others into the hall, away from where Evelyn was ladling out the last of the soup, and he spoke low and fast. You boys seeing what I'm seeing. The roof, Big Pete said grimly. The stovepipe's a fire hazard. That tape won't hold past spring, and she's running that thing at 58 degrees to save on wood. Window in the back's busted, Marcus added. Plastic over it. In this. He shook his head. Jack, that woman's gonna get sick. Or worse. House like this, winter like this, a lady her age living alone. I know, Jack said. Something ain't right about it, Marcus pressed. She's got that big nice kitchen, all them photos on the wall, kids, grandkids. Where are they? Why's nobody helping her? Why's she out here all alone with a roof that's caving in and a stove that's gonna burn the place down? I don't know, Jack said, but I aim to find out. And right then, before any of them could say another word, Evelyn's voice came drifting down the hall, light and warm and completely unaware of what these men had just seen, of what was just beginning to set itself in motion in the minds of 100 riders who could not let what they'd witnessed go. Boys, the cocoa's ready, and I found Harold's old checkerboard if any of you want a game. We're snowed in till morning anyhow. Might as well make a night of it. Jack Morrison looked at the woman framed in the kitchen doorway, this small, fierce widow who'd called them good men when the whole world called them something else, and he made a promise to himself, silent iron unbreakable. She saved every one of us tonight. One way or another, we're going to save her back. He just had no idea, standing there in that drafty hallway at 1 a.m, exactly how big that promise was about to become. He didn't know about the phone calls that would start before dawn. He didn't know about the word that would travel from club to club, state to state, faster than any storm. He didn't know that 100 men shivering in a barn in Montana were about to set something in motion that would bring a town to a standstill and a community to its knees. He only knew the promise. Coming, ma'am, he called back. His voice didn't shake this time. Set up that checkerboard, and Miss Evelyn. Yes, Jack. He looked at her a long moment. Outside the blizzard howled on, burying the world in white, sealing them all together in that little farmhouse for one more night. Thank you, he said, for seeing us. Evelyn Carter smiled, really smiled, the first real one in 2 long years. Thank you, she said softly, for needing to be seen. And out in the dark, the snow kept falling, and the wind kept screaming, and not one single soul in that house had any idea that by this time tomorrow, the thunder rolling toward Evelyn's farmhouse wouldn't be a storm at all. The checkerboard never got finished. They set it up, Jack and the boy, tied red against black on Harold's old warped board, but somewhere around the third move, Evelyn started talking about her husband, and the game just stopped mattering. The men leaned in, even the ones in the barn drifted back inside in 2s and 3s until the kitchen and the living room were packed with leather and beards and quiet listening faces. I was a paramedic, my Harold, Evelyn said, turning a checker over and over in her fingers without seeing it. 20 years. You'd be amazed what that man saw. Car wrecks, house fires. He pulled a little girl out of the Yellowstone River once, March water so cold it should have killed them both. He gave her his coat and drove her to the hospital in his undershirt. She smiled at the memory. Came home blue as you were tonight, Tyler. I yelled at him for an hour. Then I cried for 2. What happened to him, ma'am? Tyler asked softly. If it's okay to ask. Jack shot the kid a look. Don't, but Evelyn waved it off. Cancer, she said. It's all right, honey. I can say the word now. Took me a while, but I can. Pancreatic. By the time they found it, there wasn't anything to do but making him comfortable. Her thumb pressed hard into the wooden checker. 11 months. He went from a man who could carry me up the stairs to a man I had to feed with a spoon. And I did it every day because that's what you do. You don't run from the hard part. The hard part is the part that counts. The room had gone dead silent. 100 men who'd seen the worst the road had to offer, and not one of them was breathing loud. He died in the spring, Evelyn went on. April. The lilacs were just coming up out front. He planted those for me on our 10th anniversary. He held my hand and he said, Evie, don't you dare stop living just because I'm done. Her voice caught just once and steadied. And I lied to him. I said I wouldn't, but I did, boys. I did stop. For 2 years, I just stopped. Got up, ate something, watched the clock, went to bed, got up. What was the point? Kids gone, grandkids I see twice a year. If I'm lucky, a phone that don't ring. She set the checker down at last. Then 100 half-frozen bikers knocked on my door. And for the first time since the lilacs, I had a reason to get out of bed at 11 o'clock at night. Big Pete cleared his throat. It came out rougher than he meant it to. Ma'am, where's your family, your kids? Sarah's in Phoenix. Michael's out in Connecticut. Evelyn said the names carefully like they were fragile. They call. Sarah every Sunday, regular as church. They're good kids, busy kids. Sarah's got 3 of her own and a husband who travels. And Michael, well, Michael and I had words a while back, and we don't talk the way we used to. She shrugged. They want me to sell the place. Move to one of those communities. Assisted living. Sarah's got a brochure she keeps mailing me. You don't want to go, Jack said. It wasn't a question. This is Harold's house, Evelyn said simply. He built that porch with his own hands. He's in the walls. He's in those lilacs. I sell this place, I sell him. She lifted her chin. I'd rather freeze. And there it was, that word again, the one she didn't mean as a confession, but landed like one in a room full of men who'd spent the last hour cataloging every cracked window and leaking pipe and taped up seam in the house. I'd rather freeze. Jack caught Pete's eye. Pete caught Marcus's. Nobody said a word. But something passed between them, silent and certain, the way a decision moves through a brotherhood without anyone needing to call a vote. Around 2 in the morning, Marcus found the photo. He'd been helping carry mugs back to the sink, and he stopped in front of the wall of pictures the way you do in a stranger's house when the stranger has gone gentle on you. Harold and Evelyn Young on a motorcycle of all things, a beat-up old Indian, the 2 of them grinning like fools. Marcus stared at it for a long moment. Ma'am, he called, this you on a bike? Evelyn laughed the first big laugh anybody'd heard out of her all night. That's me and Harold's summer of '74. He had that Indian before he had me. Used to take me up into the mountains every Sunday. Her eyes went soft and far away. I used to ride boys. 40 years ago, I'd have been out in that storm with you. The room exploded. Men hollering, slapping their knees, Tyler nearly falling out of his chair. She rides, somebody shouted from the barn doorway. The old gal rides. And Evelyn sat there in the middle of it, pink-cheeked and delighted, a 72-year-old widow surrounded by 100 men who an hour ago she'd been told to fear, laughing so hard she had to dab her eyes with the corner of her apron. It was Jack who noticed she'd gone quiet a few minutes later, off to the side, gripping the kitchen counter with both hands and breathing slow and careful. Miss Evelyn, he was beside her in 2 steps. You all right? Fine, she said. Fine, I just got a little dizzy. Stood up too fast is all. When'd you last eat? Jack asked. Not tonight. You've been feeding us all night. When'd you last eat something yourself? Evelyn opened her mouth and then closed it, and the answer was right there on her face for any man with eyes to see. Marcus, Jack said quietly, not taking his eyes off her. Get a bowl of that soup now. I'm fine, Jack. I don't need. With respect, ma'am, you're going to sit down in that chair and you're going to eat, or I'm going to pick you up and put you in it myself, and you already told me you can't stop me. There was no anger in it, just a flat, immovable tenderness. You've been taking care of everybody but you. Now it's your turn. Sit. And Evelyn Carter, who had not let a single soul take care of her in 2 years, who had buried her husband and swallowed her grief and run a freezing house on 58 degrees and an empty stomach because she'd decided somewhere along the line that she wasn't worth heeding. Evelyn Carter sat down. She ate the soup slowly, and about halfway through the bowl, with 100 bikers pretending very hard not to watch, 2 tears slid down her cheeks and dropped into the broth, and she didn't wipe them away because her hands were busy holding the spoon, and because for the first time in 2 years somebody had told her to take care of herself and meant it. Nobody's made me a bowl of anything, she whispered, since Harold. Jack crouched down beside her chair so they were eye to eye. Big as he was, he made himself small for her. Well, he said, his voice gone thick. Get used to it, Miss Evelyn, 'cause I got a feeling you're about to have more people looking out for you than you know what to do with. She thought he was just being kind. She had no idea he meant it as a fact. The phone call started at 4 in the morning. Jack stepped out to the barn where it was loud and the wood stove roared, and he pulled out his cell, and against all odds, against the storm, against the deadlines, against everything he found, one shaky bar of signal up in the hayloft. He called a man named Reggie down in Wyoming, the president of a chapter 300 miles south, a man Jack had ridden with for 15 years. Reggie, it's Jack. No, everybody's fine. We're alive. Listen to me. I got to tell you about a woman. He told it plain. The knock, the door, the soup, the blankets. Close that door before one of us decides to do something you'll regret. And what she'd said back. The bucket under the leak, the taped up stove, the 58 degrees. I'd rather freeze. The bowl of soup with 2 tears in it. There was a long silence on the line when he finished. Then Reggie's voice came back, and it was not steady. How far is it from us to her? Reggie, the roads are. They're opening by noon, weather guy says. How far, Jack? 5 hours, maybe 6 in the slush. But Reg, I'm not asking you to. You're not asking me anything, Reggie said. I'm telling you, me and the boys are going to be on that woman's road tomorrow, and we're bringing whatever she needs. You make me a list. Roof, stove, windows, all of it. I'll start calling around tonight. Reggie. Jack, Reggie's voice cracked clean in half. My mama died alone in a cold house. You know that. Found 3 days later. 3 days. You're telling me there's a woman out there freezing in the dark and letting 100 strangers in out of the goodness of her heart, and you think I'm going to sleep tonight? A ragged breath. Make the list. I'll handle the rest. Jack stood in that hayloft with the phone pressed to his ear and the storm howling outside in a single bar of signal holding by a thread, and he understood that he'd just lit a match he could not put out. Because Reggie called Tucson, and Tucson called Denver, and Denver called a chapter in the Dakotas, and that chapter called Idaho. And somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, in barns and garages, and over kitchen tables across half the country, the story of the old woman in the Montana blizzard went from man to man to man, picking up speed, like the storm in reverse, and every single one of them said some version of the same thing. My mother, my grandmother, could have been mine, won't be hers. By the time the gray light of morning crept across the snow, Jack Morrison had a list in his jacket pocket written on the back of a feed store receipt: roof stove pipe, electrical 3 windows pantry, and at the bottom underlined twice the truck, and he had absolutely no idea that the thing he'd started in that hayloft had already grown 100 times bigger than the list. He thought maybe Reggie and a few boys might show. 20, 30 men with a couple of trucks. He thought that would be a fine thing, a kind thing, a way to pay her back. He did not yet know about the 800. Inside the house, the bikers were stirring, and Evelyn was already at the stove. Of course, she was making coffee for an army with the last of her grounds, and Tyler, the blue-lipped boy from the night before, was sitting at her kitchen table watching her work with an expression Jack couldn't quite name when he came in stamping snow off his boots. "You're up early, son," Evelyn said to Tyler without turning around. "Couldn't sleep, ma'am. Feet warm." "Yes, ma'am, all 10 toes, thanks to you." She smiled into the coffee pot. "Well, that's something, isn't it? 10 for 10. Tyler was quiet a moment. Then in a small voice, he said the thing he'd been working up to all night. "Ma'am, can I ask you something last night when Big Jack came to the door when he said that thing about regret, about doing something you'd regret? Why'd you let us in anyway? You're a little old lady alone in a house in the middle of nowhere. We could have been anybody. We could have done anything." His voice wobbled. "My own grandma would have called the cops. So why'd you trust us?" Evelyn set down the pot. She turned around and looked at this skinny 19-year-old kid with the bad tattoo on his neck, and the eyes that had clearly seen things a 19-year-old's eyes shouldn't. And she came over and sat down across from him at her own kitchen table. "Tyler, can I tell you something true?" "Yes, ma'am." "I didn't trust you because I knew you were safe," she said. "I didn't know that. You're right, you could have been anybody. I let you in anyway." "You know why?" Tyler shook his head. "Because 40 years ago I had a boy in my 3rd grade class," Evelyn said. "Big for his age, rough, came to school with bruises he wouldn't explain and a chip on his shoulder you could see from the back row. Every other teacher had given up on him. Said he was trouble, said he'd end up in prison, said don't waste your time. And one day that boy threw a chair across my classroom." She paused. "And instead of sending him to the principal, I sat down next to him on the floor where he'd run to hide, and I didn't say a word. I just sat for 20 minutes. And finally that boy looked at me and he said, 'Why aren't you yelling at me like everybody else?' And I said, 'Because I think somebody's been yelling at you your whole life, and look how much good it's done.'" The kitchen was silent. "That boy's name was David," Evelyn said. "He's a firefighter now, down in Missoula. Captain. He sends me a Christmas card every year 40 years running, and every single one of them says the same thing at the bottom." Her voice went soft. "Thank you for not being scared of me." She reached across the table and put her small hand over Tyler's big one. "So when Jack stood on my porch last night," she said, "and tried to give me a reason to be afraid of him, all I could see was David, a boy the whole world decided was dangerous before he ever got a chance to be anything else. And I thought, I am 72 years old. I have buried my husband, and I am alone in this world. If I die tonight because I was kind to the wrong man, then I die. But I will not spend my last years on this earth slamming doors on people just because they're big and tattooed and the world told me to be scared. I won't. Harold wouldn't have. And I won't." Tyler was crying now, openly, not bothering to hide it. "You ain't the wrong man, ma'am," he choked out. "I swear to God, none of us are. We're gonna prove it. You'll see." "I already see, honey," Evelyn said gently. "I saw last night. You don't have anything to prove to me." But Tyler shook his head hard, and there was something fierce in it, something that should have warned her, and he said it again, almost a vow. "No, ma'am, you'll see." And Jack, leaning into the doorway with the feed store list burning a hole in his pocket and a single text from Reggie sitting unread on his phone, a text he hadn't yet opened, a text that would, when he finally read it 20 minutes later, out in the barn, make him sit straight down on a hay bale and put his hand over his mouth. Jack looked at the kid and the old woman holding hands across the kitchen table, and he thought about the snow plows already grinding down the highway toward the on-ramp, about the roads opening by noon, just like the weatherman promised about Reggie 300 miles south, making phone calls all night long. "I thought she has no idea what's coming." The bikers ate the last of the eggs and drank the last of the coffee, and one by one they thanked her, and she walked each of them to the door and pressed something into their hands as they left a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a pair of Harold's wool socks, a paper cup of coffee for the road, because that was just who she was giving away the last of what she had to men who had nothing left to give her and everything left to give. "You boys ride safe now," she called from the porch as they dug their bikes out of the drifts. And you come back and see me sometime you hear, don't be strangers. Jack was the last to leave. He stood on her porch and looked at her, this small, fierce woman wrapped in her dead husband's cardigan, and he found he couldn't quite get the words out around the thing in his throat. Miss Evelyn, he managed, last night you asked me why you weren't scared of us. You said it was the least scared you'd felt in 2 years, 'cause somebody finally needed you. He swallowed hard. I just want you to know, we needed you. Every one of us, more than you'll ever know, and I don't aim to forget it. You're a good man, Jack Morrison, Evelyn said. Whatever the world told you, you're a good man. Jack got on his bike. He didn't trust himself to say anything else. He thumbed the starter and the engine caught, and one by one, 100 engines roared to life behind him, and Evelyn stood on her porch and waved as they pulled out onto the freshly plowed road in a long, thundering line, leather and chrome and exhaust, and she watched until the last of them disappeared over the rise, and the sound faded into the cold morning air. Then it was quiet again, the way it always was. She went back inside her empty house, 58 degrees, and dropping the bucket, dripping in the corner, and she washed every dish by hand, and she folded every blanket, and she sat down at her kitchen table where Tyler's tears had dried on the wood, and she said out loud to nobody, to Harold, well, wasn't that something? She thought it was over. She thought she'd had her one good night, her one reason to get out of bed, and now it was back to the clock and the quiet and the long gray stretch of being alone. She did not know that 20 miles south, the first wave of trucks was already turning onto the highway. She did not know that Jack Morrison had pulled over at the first gas station with a signal and finally read Reggie's text, the one that made him sit down hard on the curb. She did not know that the text said only 6 words that were about to turn her whole world upside down. Jack, it's not going to be 30. Jack sat on that frozen curb outside the gas station and read the 6 words 3 times before they made sense. Jack, it's not going to be 30. He typed back with cold thumbs. How many, Reg? The reply took a minute. When it came, Jack stopped breathing. Last count I had was past 400, and folks are still calling in. Tucson chapter chartered a flatbed. Denver's bringing 2. Somebody from Salt Lake's hauling a generator big enough to run a hospital. Jack, words everywhere. I couldn't stop it now if I wanted to. You sure about this address? 400. Jack put his hand over his mouth. 400 men and folks still calling in. He'd meant to do a kindness. He'd meant for Reggie and a handful of boys to roll up with some shingles and a new stovepipe and surprise a sweet old lady. He had not meant this. This was a thing with its own engine now. This was a flood, and he'd opened the gate. He texted back one word, sure. Then he called the boys still gassing up at the pumps. Change of plans, he said. We're not going to Billings. We're going back. Marcus looked up from his bike. Back where? Back to her. It took Marcus about 2 seconds. Then a grin split his whole face. Reggie came through. Reggie came through, Jack said quietly. And then some. Marcus, it's hundreds. It's going to be hundreds. He held up the phone. I don't even know how to tell her. I don't know how you tell a woman who's been alone for 2 years that half the country's about to show up on her road. Big Pete, lacing his boot on the curb, said without looking up. You don't tell her. You let it happen. Some things you can't say in words, Jack. You just gotta let her see it. Meanwhile, 20 miles north, Evelyn Carter was on the phone with her daughter. Mom, you let how many people into the house? 100 or so. Bikers. They were stranded in the storm, Sarah. They'd have frozen. The silence on the line was the kind that has a temperature. Mom, 100 strange men in the house, with you, alone. Sarah's voice climbed with every word. Do you hear yourself? Do you have any idea anything could have happened? Anything. This is exactly what I've been. Nothing happened, sweetheart. They were lovely. There was a boy, Tyler, 19 years old, frostbite in his toes. That settles it. Sarah's voice went flat and final. I'm calling Michael. We're putting the house on the market. You can't be out there anymore. Mom, you're going to get yourself killed. And I am not. I am not going to bury you the way we buried Dad, all alone in that. Her voice broke. I can't do it again. I won't. And there it was, under the anger, the fear, the real thing, the thing that had been driving the brochures and the Sunday calls all along. Evelyn closed her eyes and held the phone tighter. Sarah, honey, listen to me. I have to go, Mom. The kid's bus is here. I'll call you tonight. Please, please don't open the door to anybody else. A pause. I love you. That's why I'm like this. You know that? I know, Evelyn whispered, but the line had already gone dead. She set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there a long while in her 58-degree house, and the loneliness came back in like water, finding a crack, and she thought, maybe she's right. Maybe I am just a foolish old woman waiting to die out here. The night with the bikers already felt like a dream, like something that had happened to a braver woman than the one standing in this cold kitchen with a dead phone and a dripping bucket and a daughter who was scared to death of losing her. She had no way of knowing that at that exact moment on a highway south of town, the first flatbed truck was downshifting for the on-ramp, and behind it, strung out for half a mile, came the bikes. It was Earl Hutchins who heard them first. Earl ran the feed store and lived 2 miles down the road from Evelyn, and he was out salting his front steps a little after 1 in the afternoon when he stopped, salt scoop in hand, and cocked his head. A sound was coming up the valley. Low at first, a rumble he felt in his chest before he heard it in his ears. Marjorie, he called into the house. Marjorie, come out here. You hear that? His wife came to the door, wiping her hands. Is that thunder in January? That ain't thunder, Earl said slowly. The sound was building, deepening, layering on top of itself until it filled the whole sky. Marjorie, that's motorcycles. By the time Evelyn heard it, the whole road was shaking. She was at the sink, washing the same coffee mug she'd been washing for 5 minutes when the window started to rattle in its frame. She thought for one heart-stopping second that it was another storm, that the weatherman had been wrong, that the worst was coming back. She dried her hands and went to the front window and pulled back the curtain. And the mug she was still holding slipped out of her fingers and shattered on the floor, and she did not even hear it break. They came over the rise the way the snow had come the night before, endless, overwhelming, more than the eye could hold. Not 100, not 200. They filled the road from her gate clear back over the hill and out of sight, headlights burning in the gray afternoon, a river of chrome and leather and rumbling steel that had no beginning and no end. The sound was a physical thing now, a pressure against the glass, against her chest, against something deep inside her she thought was permanently shut. Evelyn Carter stood frozen at her own window, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, and she whispered, Harold, Harold, are you seeing this? At the front of them all, leading the column up the long drive, was Jack Morrison. She got the door open somehow. She got herself out onto the porch on legs that didn't want to hold her, the cardigan slipping off one shoulder, the broken mug forgotten on the kitchen floor. And the bikes kept coming, peeling off the road into her fields, into Earl's field across the way, parking in rows that stretched farther than she could see, and still more poured over the rise. And the engines cut one by one until the roar became a murmur, became a hush, and then there were just hundreds and hundreds of men and women standing in the snow looking up at a 72-year-old widow on a sagging porch. Jack came up the steps. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes were wet. Miss Evelyn, he said, and his voice carried in the sudden quiet. Last night you opened your door to 100 strangers. You fed us. You warmed us. You called us good men when the whole world calls us something else. He had to stop. He pressed his lips together and started again. I made some phone calls, and those folks made some phone calls, and well, he gestured behind him at the impossible sea of them. Turns out a lot of people wanted to thank you, ma'am. Turns out word travels. Jack, her voice was barely there. How many? Reggie clocked 800 coming through the county line, Jack said softly. From 11 states. They drove all night, Miss Evelyn. Some of them are still coming. 800. Evelyn Carter put both hands over her mouth and her knees gave, and Jack caught her by the elbow, steady as a porch post, and she wept. Not the careful private weeping she'd done into a bowl of soup the night before, but great heaving sobs that came up from 2 years of silence, from a husband in the ground and children across the country and a phone that didn't ring. And the men in the field took off their hats and their helmets, every one of them, 800 heads bared in the cold, and they let her cry. A woman stepped forward out of the crowd, older, gray-haired, a patch on her vest that said, Road Mother. She climbed the steps and took Evelyn's hands in both of hers. My name's Donna Honey, she said. I rode up from Casper, 12 hours. Her chin trembled. My mother spent her last winter alone in a house with no heat because she was too proud to ask anybody for help, and we didn't know. And by the time we knew, she stopped, squeezed Evelyn's hands hard. When I heard about you, I didn't sleep. I just got on my bike. I had to come. I had to be one of the people who showed up in time for once in my life. You understand me? Evelyn couldn't speak. She just nodded and held on to the woman's hands. And then the truck started arriving, not just the flatbeds with the bikes, supply trucks pickup after pickup, a box truck with a lumberyard logo on the side, a trailer stacked with shingle bundles, another loaded with insulation and lumber, and PVC pipe and rolls of wire. A man in a welding cap leaned out of a cab and hollered, "Somebody point me at that stovepipe. I heard there's a fire hazard needs handling." Evelyn turned to Jack bewildered. How do you know about my stovepipe? Jack looked at his boots. Big Pete clocked it last night, ma'am. The stove, the roof, the windows, the thermostat set to 58. He looked up and his jaw was tight. We saw Miss Evelyn. We saw how you've been living out here, feeding 100 men out of a pantry that was near empty, wrapping us in blankets in a house you can't afford to heat. His voice roughened. You've been taking care of everybody your whole life. School kids for 40 years. Your husband for 11 months. Us all last night. He shook his head slowly. And nobody been taking care of you. So we're gonna fix that today, right now, whether you like it or not. No, Evelyn said, pulling back, the old pride flaring up. No, I can't let you. This is too much. I can't accept. Ma'am, it was Tyler pushing up through the crowd, the 19-year-old, and there were tears running down his face, and he didn't care who saw. Last night you sat down at your own table and you told me about David, the boy you didn't give up on. You said you weren't going to spend your last years slamming doors on people. Well, he spread his arms wide at the 800. These are all the doors you didn't slam, ma'am. This is what it looks like. You don't get to slam this one either. And Evelyn Carter, who had never in her life let a single soul take care of her, looked out at 800 people who had driven through the night from 11 states because she'd been kind to 100 strangers, and she stopped fighting. All right, she whispered. All right. The field erupted in a cheer that rolled up the valley and echoed off the mountains. What happened next, the town of Cold Creek would talk about for the rest of their lives. They descended on that farmhouse like an army that had only ever wanted something to build. Within the hour, a dozen roofers were up top tearing off the rotted shingles, and the welder had the dangerous stovepipe out, and a new one going in, and an electrician, a woman named Reyes, 20 years a master electrician ridden up from Idaho, was down in the crawl space with a headlamp shaking her head at wiring that should have burned the place down years ago. Lord have mercy, she called up. Miss Evelyn, you've been sleeping over a fire waiting to happen. Not anymore. I'm rewiring the whole north side. Marcus, the HVAC man from Cleveland, the one whose mother had passed in the spring. Marcus stood in front of Evelyn's wheezing old furnace with his sleeves rolled up and tears in his eyes. This thing's older than I am, he said. Should have been condemned a decade ago. He turned to her. Ma'am, my mama died in a house that was too cold, same as Donna's. I couldn't do nothing for her, but I can do this for you. He swallowed. There's a brand new high-efficiency unit on that box truck out there. Donated. I'm going to put it in myself. And come tonight, this house is going to be 72 degrees, and it's going to stay 72 degrees, and you're never going to sit in a cold kitchen again as long as you live. You hear me? Evelyn put her hand on his cheek the way a mother would. Your mama raised a fine man, Marcus. Marcus had to walk away. He couldn't answer. He just went and tore into that furnace like his life depended on it. Earl and Marjorie Hutchins came up the road and stood at the edge of it all, gaping. Then more neighbors came, the Donnellys, old Mrs. Park, the Vasquez family from down by the creek, drawn by the thunder and the rumor that was already burning up every phone line in the county. They stood in a knot at the property line, uncertain, wary the way folks are around men in leather. It was Big Pete who walked over to them, wiping his hands on a rag, the long scar pale on his face. The neighbors stiffened. Afternoon, Pete said. Y'all friends of Miss Evelyn's? Earl found his voice. We're neighbors. Lived down the road from her 20 years. Pete nodded slowly. He didn't say anything unkind. He just looked at Earl and then passed him at old Mrs. Park, and then he said in a voice without any heat in it at all, 20 years. And did any of you know she had a bucket in her kitchen catching the roof? Did anybody know her furnace was dying and she had it set to 58? Did anybody know that woman was eating once a day so she could keep the lights on? The neighbors went very quiet. I'm not saying it to shame you, Pete said. Lord knows we all got our own lives. I'm just saying we drove 12 hours through the snow, folks from 11 states who never met her, 'Cause 100 of us got warm in her house last night. He looked at them steadily. She's your neighbor, so you want to stand at the fence and watch, or you want to grab a hammer? There was a long, long pause. Then Earl Hutchins took off his good coat, rolled up his sleeves, and said, "Where do you need me?" And Mrs. Park, 81 years old, said, "I make a brisket that'll feed 50. Marjorie, get the cars. We're going to the store." And the Vasquez kids grabbed shovels, and the Donnellys went home for tools. And the whole brittle wall between the town and the bikers, 20 years of locked car doors and pulled closer children, just came down right there in Evelyn Carter's snowy field board, the way they were tearing the bad roof off her house. By late afternoon, the work was a roar of hammers and saws and generators, and Evelyn moved through it all in a daze, pressing coffee into hands, learning names, crying about every 10 minutes whether she meant to or not. She found Jack standing apart for a moment, looking up at the men on her roof, and she came and stood beside him. "I don't understand it," she said quietly. "I made some soup, Jack, that's all. I made soup and I opened a door. People do that. It shouldn't be." She gestured helplessly at the 800. Why, why all this for that?" Jack was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you something true, Miss Evelyn? The way you've been telling all of us true things since last night." "All right. Most of these people," he said, nodding out at the field, "have spent their whole lives being looked at like they're dangerous, like they're trash, like there's something to be scared of. Some of them earned a little of it, sure, but most of them are just folks the world decided not to see." He turned to her. "And then there's you, old enough to be scared of every one of us, alone, nothing to gain. And you looked right at us in the dark, and you saw people. You said good men." His voice dropped. "You got any idea how long some of these folks have been waiting for somebody to look at them like that? Their whole lives, Miss Evelyn. Their whole entire lives." Evelyn's eyes filled again. "You didn't just give us soup," Jack said. "You gave us our dignity back. For one night. And there ain't a price on that. So we're going to spend the next 2 days giving you back as much of yours as we can carry, and it still won't be even. Not by a mile." They stood together watching the work, the old widow and the mountain of a man, and neither said anything for a while because nothing needed saying. And then a vehicle came up the road that made Jack go still. It wasn't a bike. It wasn't a supply truck. It was a news van, white, a satellite dish folded on the roof, KTVM painted on the side. And behind it came another and a third, because the thunder of 800 motorcycles converging on a single Montana farmhouse does not stay a secret for long. And somewhere a sheriff's deputy had made a call, and somewhere a scanner had crackled, and now it was out in the world. A reporter climbed out, smoothing her hair, microphone in hand, eyes wide at the impossible sea of bikes. She scanned the chaos and spotted the small, gray-haired woman on the porch, and she started toward her with the cameraman jogging behind. But before she got 10 feet, Evelyn's phone rang in her cardigan pocket. She pulled it out with a shaking hand. The screen said Sarah, and Evelyn Marty understood with a lurch that her daughter, her terrified daughter, who had begged her not to open the door to anyone who 2 hours ago had announced she was selling the house, was about to see 800 bikers swarming her mother's home on the evening news with no warning, no context, nothing but the worst nightmare she'd been having for 2 years splashed across the screen. Evelyn's thumb hovered over the green button. The reporter was almost to the steps. The camera light blinked on red, and the phone kept ringing. Sarah, and Evelyn Carter stood frozen on her own porch between the daughter who was scared of losing her and the 800 strangers who had come to make sure she'd never be lost again, with absolutely no idea what she was going to say to either one of them. Evelyn pressed the green button and turned her back on the reporter. "Sarah. Mom, are you watching this? Are you seeing this? It's on the news. There's a thing on Facebook. Somebody tagged me. There's Mom. There's 1,000 bikers at your house. Somebody posted a video. Where are you? Are you safe? Are you?" Sarah, stop. Breathe. Don't tell me to breathe. "There's an army of them. I can see your porch. Mom, I can see your actual porch on the television in my kitchen in Phoenix. And there are men everywhere. And I am about to call the state police." Sarah Ann Carter, the school teacher voice. It cut clean through 3 states and 20 years. "You will put down the phone to the police, and you will listen to your mother for 1 minute. Can you do that for me?" A ragged breath on the line. Okay, 1 minute." Evelyn looked out at the field, at Marcus half inside her dead furnace, fighting for her warmth like it was his own mother's. At Rhea's coming up out of the crawl space filthy and triumphant, having pulled out the wiring that might have killed her in her sleep. At 800 people who had driven through the night, hats in their hands, so that an old woman would never again be cold or alone or unseen. Sweetheart, she said, and her voice cracked. Do you remember when you were 7 and you brought home that stray dog? The mangy one, half-starved, growling, and your daddy said it'd bite you, and the whole neighborhood said, get rid of it, it's dangerous. Mom, what does? And you sat with it on the back porch for 3 days, and you wouldn't give up on it, and on the 4th day it put its head in your lap. Evelyn's tears were running freely now. That was Buster. He slept at the foot of your bed for 14 years. He pulled you out of the pool when you were 9. The dangerous dog nobody wanted. She pressed the phone hard against her ear. You learned that from me, baby. You learned that you don't decide what something is by how it looks when it's scared and cold. You learned that from me. The line was silent. Last night, 100 men knocked on my door in the worst storm in 30 years, Evelyn said. And every voice in my head, including your sweetheart, including yours, told me to be afraid. And I looked at them and I saw Buster. I saw 100 Busters half frozen on my porch. Her voice broke completely. And I let them in, and nothing happened, Sarah. Nothing bad happened. They cried in my kitchen, and they told me about their mamas, and they ate my soup, and they thanked God for me. And now, she turned and looked at the field again, the impossible sea of them. Now they've come back, 800 of them, from 11 states, and they're fixing my roof, Sarah. They're putting in a new furnace. They found out about how I've been living out here, the things I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry, the things I was too proud to ask anybody for. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I haven't been doing so good out here, baby. I haven't. And I couldn't tell you because every time we talked, you were so scared, and I didn't want to give you one more reason. So I lied. I said I was fine. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. On the other end of the line, 2,000 miles away, Evelyn could hear her daughter start to cry. Mom, Sarah whispered. Mom, the furnace. How long has the furnace? It doesn't matter now. It's getting fixed. Today. How long, Mom? Evelyn closed her eyes. 2 winters. The sound Sarah made was the sound of a child's heart breaking. 2 winters. You've been freezing for 2 winters, and you let me mail you brochures. You let me lecture you about, oh God. Oh, Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you just tell me? Because you'd have made me sell Daddy's house, Evelyn said simply. And I wasn't ready to let go of him. I'm still not. But sweetheart, listen, these people, these wonderful, terrifying-looking, kind-hearted people, they're not making me sell it. They're making it so I can stay. They're making it safe. They're making it warm. They're giving me back the thing you've been trying to take away because you love me. She laughed through her tears. Do you see, baby, they're on your side. They want the same thing you do. They just figured out a different way to get it. There was a long silence, and then Sarah said in a small voice that Evelyn hadn't heard from her since she was a little girl, Can I talk to one of them? Evelyn blinked. What? One of the bikers, the one in charge. I want to thank him, and I want to ask him something. A shaky breath. Please, Mom. Evelyn walked to the edge of the porch and called out, Jack Morrison, come here a minute. My daughter wants a word with you. The 800 went quiet again, watching as Jack climbed the steps. He took the phone like it was made of glass. He cleared his throat. Ma'am, this is Jack. He listened. The whole field watched his face. They watched the big man, the one who'd stood on this porch the night before, and warned a frightened widow to shut her door. They watched his eyes go wet and his jaw work, and his free hand come up to grip the porch rail like he needed it to stay standing. Yes, ma'am, he said. Yes, ma'am, I understand. A long pause. No, ma'am, you don't gotta thank me. Your mother, ma'am, your mother saved 100 lives last night, including a 19-year-old kid who'd have lost his feet, maybe more. His voice thickened. We're just trying to be worth the door she opened. Another pause, and then Jack's face changed. Whatever Sarah said next hit him somewhere deep. You're asking me, he said slowly, if she's gonna be okay out here. After we leave, if she's gonna be alone again. He looked at Evelyn standing there small and waiting. No, ma'am, she's not. I give you my word on that. There's a chapter 40 minutes from here in Missoula. There's a road mother named Donna who already told me she's driving up once a week to check on her storm or shine the rest of her life. There's a kid named Tyler who I don't think you could keep away from this woman with a chain. His voice steadied into something like a vow. You're in Phoenix, ma'am, and that's a long way. So let us be your hands out here. Let us be the family that's close enough to drive over when the snow falls. We owe her a debt we can't ever pay. Letting us look after her, that's the only way you could ever let us start. A pause. Will you let us do that? The whole field held its breath. Jack listened. Then very quietly he smiled. Yes, ma'am, and he said, we'll take real good care of her. I promise you that on my life. He handed the phone back to Evelyn, and there were tear tracks down his weathered face, and he didn't wipe them away. Mumpum. Sarah's voice was different now, lighter, loosened somehow like a fist that had been clenched for 2 years finally opening. Mom, I think I'm getting on a plane tomorrow. I want to see it. I want to see the people who I want to thank them in person. And I want to see Daddy's house all fixed up. A wet laugh. And I'm bringing the kids. They should know. They should know what their grandma did. Evelyn couldn't speak for a moment. Then she managed, I'd like that, baby. I'd like that more than anything. And Mom, Sarah's voice trembled. I'm sorry for the brochures, for all of it. I was so scared of losing you that I forgot to just let you be you. The bravest woman I ever knew. The one who taught me about Buster. Oh, sweetheart, Evelyn whispered. There's nothing to be sorry for. You were loving me the only way the fear would let you. I know that. I always knew that. They said goodbye. Evelyn slid the phone back into her cardigan and she looked up at Jack, and the two of them just stood there for a second undone. And then she laughed, a wet, hiccuping, joyful laugh, and Jack laughed too. And the whole field who'd been straining to hear broke into cheers and applause without even knowing exactly what they were cheering, only that something had been mended. It was right about then that the reporter, who had been waiting at a respectful distance with a patience she didn't usually have, finally stepped forward. Her name was Carmen Reyes, no relation to the electrician, though they'd laugh about it later, and she'd covered Cold Creek County for 11 years. Mostly ribbon cuttings and grain prices and the occasional fender bender, and she had never in her career seen anything like this. Mrs. Carter, she said gently, I'm so sorry to intrude. I'm Carmen from KTVM. I won't take but a minute. Would you be willing to tell folks what happened here? People are already sharing it. They want to understand. Evelyn looked at the camera at the little red light and she shook her head. Honey, I don't know what there is to tell. I made some soup. I opened a door. Anybody would have. And that was when a voice rang out from the crowd. Tyler, the 19-year-old, standing on the bed of a pickup so he could be seen. That ain't true, ma'am, he called out, and the field went quiet. With all respect, that ain't true, and you know it. Anybody didn't. We knocked on 6 doors before yours. 6, his voice cracked. 6 houses with their lights on, and 5 of them looked through the window at 100 bikers and turned the porch light off and pretended they wasn't home. We were dying out there, ma'am. 5 doors stayed shut. He pointed at her, his whole arm shaking. You opened. You. The little old lady alone in the dark, the one with the most reason in the world to be scared. You're the one who opened, so don't you stand there and say anybody would have done it, because 5 people already proved they wouldn't. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Carmen Reyes had ever heard through a microphone. Evelyn stood very still. I didn't know that, she said softly. I didn't know you'd tried other houses. Now you know, Tyler said and climbed down off the truck, wiping his face on his sleeve. Evelyn turned back to the camera, and something in her had shifted. She didn't look like a flustered old woman anymore. She looked like a school teacher who'd decided the lesson mattered. All right, she said, and all right, I'll tell folks something, but not about me. She lifted her chin. I want to tell folks about them, because for one night I had a house full of men that the whole world is scared of. And you know what I found out? She looked straight down the lens. I found out that the men everybody's afraid of are mostly just men nobody's been kind to in a long, long time. I found out that under every one of those leather jackets is somebody's son, somebody's daddy, a veteran, a man who fixes furnaces, a boy of 19 who was crying in my kitchen because his feet hurt and he was so far from home. Her voice rang clear and strong across the field. We have got so good in this country at deciding what people are before we ever say hello to them. We lock our doors. We cross the street. We turn the porch light off. She paused. I'm 72 years old and I'm here to tell you it's a poor way to live. and it's a poorer way to die. So if you take one thing from this old woman, take this: open the door. You might just find out that the thing you were afraid of has come to save your whole life. Carmen Reyes lowered her microphone. She wasn't even sure she'd gotten the shot. Her eyes were too blurred to see the viewfinder. That clip, those 90 seconds on a Montana porch, would be shared 11 million times by the end of the week. But Evelyn didn't know that yet, and she didn't care because the work was calling her back. The afternoon poured into evening and the evening into night, and they did not stop. Floodlights went up, run off the big generator from Salt Lake, and the hammering went on under the stars. The new roof took shape, dark and tight and true. Marcus emerged from the basement at 9 o'clock at night, black with grime, and walked to the thermostat and turned it up, and a few minutes later, a warmth began to roll through Evelyn Carter's house that it had not known in 2 long years. She walked from room to room with her hand out, feeling it, feeling the heat come up out of the vents. She stood in the back bedroom, the one with the cracked window that had been covered in plastic and a board, the one that had been Michael's room when he was a boy, and she found that the window was new, real glass sealed and warm, and somebody had even painted the trim. And she sat down on the edge of the old bed in her son's old room, in her warm house, and she put her face in her hands. That was where Jack found her. "Miss Evelyn, you all right?" "Jack," she looked up. "Michael's window, the cracked one. Somebody fixed Michael's window." "Yes, ma'am," Reyes and a couple of the boys. "Michael's my son. We had a falling out, I told you, 3 years ago at Harold's funeral. Words got said, bad ones on both sides. We haven't really spoken since." Her hands twisted in her lap. "He doesn't even know about any of this. Sarah was going to call him, but I don't know if he'll." And right then, as if the universe itself had been waiting for the cue, Evelyn's phone rang again. She pulled it out. She looked at the screen, and her whole body went rigid. The screen said Michael. Jack saw her face. "You want me to step out?" "No," she whispered. "No, stay. Please, I might need." She didn't finish. Her thumb was shaking too hard to swipe. It took her 3 tries to answer, "Michael." Silence on the line. Then in a voice gone rough and uncertain, a man's voice, deep, but with a little boy somewhere underneath it. "Mom, Sarah called me. She sent me a video. There's a lot of motorcycles." A long pause. Is that really your porch?" "It's really my porch, baby." Another silence longer, and then Michael's voice broke clean apart. "Mom, the video, the lady reporter, the thing you said at the end about opening the door. Mom, I've watched it 40 times. I can't stop watching it." He was crying now, this grown man in Connecticut, 2,000 miles away. And there was a part they showed the house, they panned across the front of the house, and I saw my old window. The cracked one. From when I threw the baseball through it, when I was 12 and Dad was so mad, and he made you mow lawns all summer to pay for it, Evelyn whispered. "And you never did fix it right. It always whistled in the wind." "It always whistled," Michael choked. "And in the video, it's somebody fixed it, Mom. Somebody fixed my window." And he couldn't get it out for a second. "I've been so angry about Dad, about what I said to you, about what you said to me, and I let it go. 3 years, 3 whole years, and I almost let it go forever. Over nothing, over grief. And then I saw a bunch of strangers fixing the window I broke when I was 12, taking better care of you than your own son, and Michael, I can't do it anymore, Mom. I can't be the son who wasn't there. I can't be the fifth door. I can't be one of the people who turned the light off." He was sobbing openly now. "I'm so sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry. Will you let me come home? Can I come home?" Evelyn Carter sat on the edge of her son's bed in her warm house with the new window, and she could not speak, and Jack Morrison quietly reached over and put his huge hand on her shoulder, steadying her the same way he'd steadied her elbow on the porch when the 800 came over the hill. "Baby," she finally managed, "there has never been one single second in your whole life when you couldn't come home. Not one. The door's open. The door has always been open." "I'm getting on a plane." Michael said the same words his sister had said an hour before, the two of them flying home from opposite ends of the country, to the mother they'd almost lost to fear and pride and grief. "First flight I can get. I'm coming home, Mom." When she hung up, Evelyn looked up at Jack with an expression he would carry with him for the rest of his days. "Jack," she said, Last night you knocked on my door and I thought I was saving your lives. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling like the sun coming up. But you've gone and given me back my whole family. My daughter's coming. My son's coming home. My son who I thought I'd lost. She gripped his hand. You didn't fix my roof, Jack. You fixed my life. Jack couldn't answer. He just sat down on the edge of the bed beside her, this giant of a man, and the two of them sat there in the warm quiet while outside the floodlights burned and the hammers rang. And 800 people worked through the Montana night to rebuild the home of a woman who had opened her door when 5 others slammed theirs. And down at the end of the road, more headlights were turning in. Word was still spreading. They were still coming. Out near the gate, Big Pete was directing the new arrivals into the overflow field, and he stopped, and he squinted at a particular set of headlights pulling slowly up the drive. Not a motorcycle, not a supply truck, but a county sheriff's cruiser, and then a second one behind it, and then a black SUV with government plates. And Pete felt something tighten in his gut, because 800 bikes converging on one property tends to draw more than just reporters and well-wishers. And somebody official had clearly decided it was time to come find out exactly what was going on out at the Carter place. The cruiser doors opened, and the man who climbed out, settling his hat on his head and looking out over the impossible sea of motorcycles filling every field. As far as the floodlights reached was Sheriff Dale Brennan, a man who had his own history with Jack Morrison's club, a history that went back 15 years, a history that had not ended well. Sheriff Dale Brennan walked into the floodlights, and the hammering didn't stop, but it got quieter, the way a room goes when trouble walks in. Jack came down off the porch to meet him. Big Pete drifted in from the gate, and a dozen others closed ranks behind Jack. Not threatening, just present the way. A brotherhood gathers when one of its own steps towards something with teeth. Teeth. 15 years was a long time, but some things a man doesn't forget. Morrison, the sheriff said. Sheriff Brennan, Jack said evenly. The two men stood looking at each other across a gulf of history. Brennan's eyes moved over the 800 bikes, the supply trucks, the floodlights, the men on the half-finished roof. Last time I saw you, Brennan said slowly, was the night your boys in the Ironsides tore up the rusty spur, and I spent 6 hours in the ER with a kid had a bottle broke over his head. His jaw tightened. Your club's name has not been a welcome sound in my county for 15 years, Jack. And now I get a call. There's 1,000 of you swarming the Carter place. An old widow lives alone, and you'll forgive me if my first thought wasn't what a nice gesture. Sheriff Marcus started, heat rising in his voice. Easy, Jack said, not turning around. He kept his eyes on Brennan. You're right. 15 years ago, we were younger and dumber, and we did some things I'm not proud of. That night at the Spur, I was there. I didn't throw the bottle, but I was there and I didn't stop it, and that's on me, same as if I had. He let that sit. But Sheriff, I'm going to ask you to walk up onto that porch with me. And I'm going to ask you to talk to the woman who lives in this house. And then you decide what you think we are. Fair? Before Brennan could answer, the front door opened, and Evelyn Carter stepped out onto her new railed porch, and her voice rang out across the field, clear as a school bell. Dale Brennan, is that you carrying on? Young there? The sheriff went still. Mrs. Carter. Don't you, Mrs. Carter me. I taught you long division in the 4th grade. And you cried when you got a B. She came down the steps, ignoring Jack's hand, ignoring everyone, marching right up to a sheriff 3 times her size and 40 years her junior. Now what is all this about? Brennan took his hat off. He couldn't help it. 40 years fell away, and he was 9 years old again. Mrs. Carter, ma'am, I got a call about a large gathering, and given the parties involved, I came out to make sure you were safe. Safe, Evelyn said the word like it tasted funny. Dale, do you know how I spent the last 2 winters in this house? No, ma'am. At 58 degrees, eating once a day, with a bucket in my kitchen, catching the rain through a roof I couldn't afford to fix and wiring in my walls, that this nice lady from Idaho says should have burned me alive in my sleep. Her voice didn't waver. 2 winters, Dale. I live 4 miles from the sheriff's station. I went to church with half this county for 50 years, and not one single soul knew. Not one came to check. She pointed at Jack at the 800. These men got warm in my house one time, and they drove through the night from 11 states and make sure I'd never be cold again. They fixed my roof. They put in a furnace. They rebuilt the porch you're standing on. Her eyes flashed. So you came out here to find out if I'm safe from them. Dale Brennan, the only thing I've ever needed saving from in this town is being forgotten. And the men your county's been scared of for 15 years are the only ones who came. The sheriff stood there with his hat in his hands, and the whole field watched 800 faces in the floodlights, waiting. And Dale Brennan, 51 years old, 26 years behind a badge, looked down at the porch boards under his boots. The new ones still smelling of fresh-cut pine, and something moved across his face that his deputies had never once seen there. My mother, he said, and his voice came out wrong thick. My mother lives alone, other side of the county, 83. He swallowed hard. I keep meaning to get out there. There's always a shift. There's always something about him. He looked up and his eyes were wet, and he didn't care who saw. When'd I last check her furnace, I wonder? When'd I last... He stopped. He put his hat back on. And then Sheriff Dale Brennan turned to the 800 bikers filling the fields of Coal Creek County, and he said loud and clear, anybody here knows their way around a hot water heater? My mother's been complaining hers runs cold for a year, and I never once went and looked. A roar went up from the field that shook the snow off the trees. After we finish here, Sheriff, Jack said, and he stuck out his hand. We'll caravan out there tomorrow. Whole crew. Won't take but an afternoon. Dale Brennan looked at that scarred, weathered hand. 15 years of bad blood hung in the air between them. Then he took it, and he shook it. And the two men held on a beat longer than a handshake needs, and when they let go, something 15 years old and ugly had finally been put down for good. Sarah's plane landed the next morning. Michael's came in that afternoon. They drove out from the airport in a rented car, the two of them, brother and sister, who'd barely spoken in 3 years. And somewhere on that highway, with the mountains rising up white on either side, Sarah reached over and took her brother's hand, and Michael let her, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying anymore. When they came over the rise and saw it, the new roof gleaming, the porch rebuilt. 300 bikes still parked in the fields, smoke curling warm from the chimney of the house they'd grown up in. Michael had to pull over. He put the car in park, and he put his forehead on the steering wheel, and he wept, and his sister put her arms around him. And that was how their mother found them, walking down her own driveway, in a coat somebody had bought her, when the two grown children she'd nearly lost came stumbling out of that car and into her arms at the same time. Evelyn Carter held both her children in her front yard, surrounded by 800 strangers who'd become family, and she said the only thing there was to say. You came home. You both came home. The work finished by sundown on the second day. They didn't just fix the house, they made it better than it had ever been. New roof, new furnace, new wiring, new windows, a porch that would outlast everyone standing on it. Mechanics had Harold's old pickup running for the first time in 3 years. It turned over on the first try, and the whole field cheered like a touchdown. The pantry was stocked floor to ceiling, and the fun the veteran riders had started passed hat to hat, posted online, after Carmen Reyes's clip went around the world, came to more than $90,000. Enough to wipe out the medical debt. Enough that Evelyn Carter would never lie awake doing math in a coal bed again. When Donna, the road mother from Casper, pressed the check into her hands, Evelyn tried to give it back. She always tried to give things back. Honey, Donna said, closing the old woman's fingers around it. My mama died too proud to take a dollar from anybody. Don't you do that to these people. They need to give this to you. Do you understand? You let 100 men feel like good men for one night. Now let 800 of them feel like they finally got somewhere in time. You're not taking anything. You're giving us the thing we drove all night for. Let us have it. And Evelyn Carter looked down at the check and then out at all of them, and she understood at last that her whole life she'd had it backwards, that letting people love you is its own kind of gift to them. And she nodded, and she held the check to her chest, and she said, thank you. Thank you all. I'll never be able to. You already did, called Tyler from the crowd. Night one, you already did, ma'am. They held the first blizzard ride that same spring when the lilacs Harold planted came up purple along the front of the house. They came back not 800 but more, because the story had grown legs and the story had grown wings. And they made it a tradition. Every year on the anniversary of the night, 100 frozen riders knocked on a door that 5 other houses had slammed the thunder rolls, up the valley into Coal Creek County, and the fields fill with chrome, and an old woman stands on a porch built by the hands of men the world taught her to fear. The network they founded, Open Door, they called it, after what she said to the camera, spread across 40 states inside 2 years. They found the forgotten ones. The widows at 58 degrees, the veterans in cold houses, the old men eating once a day too proud to say a word. They fixed roofs and furnaces and wiring, and they sat at kitchen tables and learned names and asked about mothers. And somewhere in America right now tonight, there is an elderly person who is warm because 100 bikers got warm in Evelyn Carter's house in a blizzard, and the kindness just kept going the way a single open door can let in a whole world. Sarah moved back. Not all the way, she kept the place in Phoenix, but she's at her mother's 6 months of the year now, and the grandchildren know the way to Montana by heart. Michael calls every Sunday the way his sister always did, and he came home for good. Last fall took a job in Missoula, 40 minutes down the road, close enough to drive over when the snow falls. The window he broke when he was 12, the one the bikers fixed, he never let anybody touch again. He says it's perfect the way it is. He says it doesn't whistle anymore. Jack Morrison and Evelyn Carter talk every week. He calls her his second mother, and she calls him her best, worst-looking friend. And when his own days got hard a year later, when the road and the years and an old injury caught up with him, and he didn't know how he'd make it through the winter, it was Evelyn who showed up at his door 400 miles away with a stock pot of soup and a stubborn chin. And it was Evelyn who sat with him and said, "You don't run from the hard part, Jack. The hard part is the part that counts. You taught me that the night you knocked on my door." And Sheriff Dale Brennan goes out to his mother's place every single Sunday now. Checks the furnace himself, stays for supper. He says it's the best thing the badge ever made him do that night. He drove out to the Carter place expecting trouble and found the truth instead. Years later, a young reporter, not Carmen, a new one doing a piece on the 10th Blizzard ride, asked Evelyn Carter the question everyone always asked. "Weren't you afraid 100 strange men alone in the dark? How did you know it would turn out all right?" And Evelyn, older, now slower, but with the same iron under the warmth, looked at the young woman and gave the answer she'd give until the day she died. "I didn't know," she said. "That's the whole thing, honey. That's the only thing. I didn't know it would turn out all right. Nobody ever does. You don't open the door because you know what's on the other side. You open it because somebody's cold and you're warm, and that's enough." She looked out at the fields full of motorcycles, at her children, at the 800 who'd become 1,000, who'd become a family that stretched across a continent. Fear keeps the door shut, and a shut door has never once in the history of this world let anything good come in. I was alone and dying by inches behind a locked door, and the day I opened it, my whole life walked through. She passed 4 years later in the spring with the lilacs coming up in a warm house, surrounded by her son and her daughter and her grandchildren, and a gray-bearded man named Jack, who held her hand the way she'd once held his. They came from all 40 states for the ride that year. 2,000 of them, and when the engines went quiet at the end, Jack Morrison stood on the porch she'd opened to 100 strangers in a blizzard, and he told the crowd the only thing that ever needed to be said about Evelyn Carter. "She didn't see 100 bikers that night," he said, his voice carrying across a sea of bowed heads. "She saw 100 suns, and she opened the door." The thunder of 2,000 engines rolled up the valley one last time in her honor, and it echoed off the mountains, and it did not sound like a storm at all. It sounded like a whole country finally learning to open the door. Orchestrated emotional YouTube script structure for a dialogue-heavy narrative to a mature audience. Orchestrated emotional YouTube script structure for a dialogue-heavy narrative to a mature audience. If anybody out there can see this, please God, don't look away from me. Those were the words trembling on Emma Collins's lips as she pressed a torn receipt against the back window of a speeding van. 2 words scrawled in black marker. Kidnapped. Help. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold them up. Cars passed, faces turned, and one by one they all looked away until a line of motorcycles caught the desperate flash of white paper in the afternoon sun. Before we go any further, do me one small favor. Subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because this story will break your heart and put it back together. And in the comments, tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see just how far Emma's story travels. The first thing Emma noticed wasn't the rope around her wrists. It was the silence. For nearly 2 hours, the man driving the van hadn't said a single word to her. Not a threat, not a demand, nothing. And somehow that quiet was worse than any scream could have been, because it meant he had stopped caring whether she lived or died. She kept telling herself this wasn't real. That she'd wake up in her tiny apartment in Billings with the morning sun coming through the curtains and her phone alarm buzzing on the nightstand. That she'd laugh about the nightmare over coffee. But the metal floor was hard against her hip. The air inside the van was hot enough to choke on, and every bump in the road sent a fresh spike of pain through her bruised shoulder. It was real. All of it. "Where are we going?" she finally whispered. No answer. "Please, my parents, they don't have money. If that's what you want, they don't have it. I swear to you." Still nothing, just the steady roar of the engine and the rattle of the doors. The man behind the wheel was named Travis Boone, though Emma didn't know that yet. All she knew was the back of his head, the grease-stained collar of his shirt, and the way his knuckles went white on the steering wheel every time a police car appeared in the distance. He drove like a man who had already decided there was no going back. And Emma was smart enough, terrified enough to understand what that meant for her. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe. "Think, Emma, think. You're 23 years old. You are not going to die in the back of some stranger's van on a road you've never even heard of." Her own voice in her head sounded braver than she felt. She'd grown up the only child of Frank and Diane Collins, a quiet couple who ran a small hardware store, and never once raised their voices at her in 23 years. Her father had taught her to change a tire before she could legally drive. Her mother had taught her to keep her chin up no matter how scared she got. "Fear is just your body asking you what you're going to do about it," Diane used to say. "So you answer it." Emma opened her eyes. She was going to answer it. She started moving slowly, carefully, so the man up front wouldn't hear her shifting. Her wrists were bound with a length of cord, but he'd done it in a hurry, and there was just enough slack for her fingers to move. She felt along the filthy floor of the van behind the wheel, well under the edge of the bench seat. Her fingers brushed paper. An old receipt, crumpled and soft from age, wedged into the gap where the seat met the wall. And next to it, "Thank you, God," a thick marker the kind movers used to label boxes, the cap half off and dried, but still good. Her heart slammed against her ribs. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a phone, but it was something. And in that moment, something was everything. She held the receipt flat against her knee and uncapped the marker with her teeth. Her hand was shaking so violently that the first letter came out as a jagged scrawl. She forced herself to slow down, to press harder, to make the letters big enough that a stranger going 50 miles an hour could read them in a half-second glance. "Kidnapped." She paused, listening. The driver hadn't noticed. "Help." 2 words. The most important 2 words she would ever write in her life. Now came the hard part. The back of the van had 2 small windows in the rear doors, smeared with dust and grime. If she could get the sign up against that glass, if just one person on this endless highway happened to look at the right second, maybe this nightmare would have a different ending. But to do that, she'd have to move into the open. She'd have to risk him seeing her in the mirror. Emma looked at the back of Travis Boone's head and made a decision that took every ounce of courage her mother had ever poured into her. She moved. Inch by inch, she dragged herself toward the rear doors, her bound hands clutching the sign, her eyes never leaving that grease-stained collar up front. Every creak of the van's floor made her freeze. Every glance he threw at the mirror made her press herself flat. It took her almost 3 full minutes to cross a space of 4 feet, and by the time she reached the doors, the back of her shirt was soaked through with sweat. She rose up onto her knees. She pressed the sign flat against the dirty glass, and she prayed. The highway behind them was a long gray ribbon under a brutal Montana sky. Cars came and went. A pickup truck, a minivan with a family inside, 2 kids in the back seat, a semi hauling cattle. Emma held the sign up with everything she had, mouthing the words, "Please, please, please," until her lips were dry. The minivan pulled closer. For one electric second, Emma made eye contact with the woman in the passenger seat, a mother maybe 40, with sunglasses pushed up on her head. The woman looked right at the sign, and then she looked away. The minivan changed lanes and was gone. Emma's stomach dropped through the floor. She saw it, and she did nothing. The despair that crashed over her in that moment was almost physical, a weight pressing down on her chest until she could barely draw a breath. Maybe people didn't believe it. Maybe they thought it was a prank, a joke, a sticker on the glass. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they just didn't want to get involved. Maybe nobody was coming. She felt the tears building hot and useless, and she shoved them back down. No, you answer the door. You don't lie down for it. She kept the sign up. The pickup truck passed. Gone. A sports car. Gone. An old sedan with an elderly man hunched over the wheel. He squinted, frowned, and then he too drifted past and vanished into the heat shimmer of the highway. How many people had seen it now? 5, 6? And not a single one had done a thing. Emma's arms were burning. Her knees ached against the hard floor. The driver shifted in his seat up front, and she nearly dropped the sign in panic, but he was only reaching for a bottle of water. He hadn't noticed her yet. That was the one mercy in all of this. He was too consumed by his own fear of getting caught to look behind him. She kept holding the sign. And then she heard it. A sound underneath the roar of the engine. A low, rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It built and built until it filled the whole inside of the van, a sound she felt in her chest before she could even name it. Motorcycles, a lot of them. Emma twisted to look through the dusty glass and her breath caught in her throat. Coming up fast behind the van was a line of riders, 8, 10, maybe a dozen of them strung out across the highway in a loose formation, sunlight glinting off chrome and leather. They were big men on big machines, the kind of men that most folks would cross the street to avoid. Beards, tattoos, cuts and patches on their backs. The kind of men the world had decided to be afraid of a long time ago. And every instinct Emma had ever been taught about strangers screamed at her to be afraid of them too. But she was out of options. She was out of everything except 2 words on a torn receipt. She pressed the sign harder against the glass and stared straight at the man leading them. He was older than the rest, gray, and his beard lines carved deep around his eyes, a stillness to him that the younger riders didn't have. He rode like a man who had nowhere left to prove anything, which somehow made him the most commanding figure of them all. For one long second, his eyes found the window. His eyes found the sign. And then his eyes found her. Emma would never for the rest of her life be able to fully describe what happened in that moment. But she saw it. She saw the exact instant the words registered on his face, the half second of disbelief, then the hardening of his jaw, then something else. Something that made the breath rush out of her lungs in a single sob. He believed her. He was the first one who believed her. Wyatt Hunter had buried a lot of things in 58 years. He'd buried friends in the desert overseas when he was barely older than a kid himself. He'd buried his wife 3 winters ago after a fight with cancer that took everything she had, and most of what he had too. He'd buried the version of himself that used to think the world made sense, and he'd replaced it with a simpler creed. You help who you can while you can, because nobody is promised tomorrow. That creed was why he'd founded the Iron Saints. Not a gang no matter what the sideways looks at the gas stations suggested, but a riding club full of men who'd spent their whole lives being useful and didn't know how to stop. Veterans, tradesmen, a couple of guys who'd done some hard time and come out the other side determined to do better. They raised money for the children's hospital in town. They escorted funeral processions for fallen soldiers when the family had no one else. They were every last one of them, exactly the kind of men the world looked away from. So Wyatt knew a thing or two about being looked away from. That afternoon, the Iron Saints were 40 minutes into a charity ride for a little girl named Sophie Marsh, who needed surgery her parents couldn't afford. Wyatt had her photo taped to his tank, the gap-toothed 7-year-old in a yellow dress, and every mile of the ride was for her. His mind was on the road, on the riders behind him, on whether they'd make their fundraising goal by the weekend. His mind was 1,000 miles from kidnapping. And then a battered cargo van drifted into his lane up ahead, and something in the rear window caught the light. At first, Wyatt thought it was a bumper sticker, a faded ad, nothing. But the closer he rode, the clearer it got, and then his whole body went cold despite the summer heat. A face, a young woman's face pressed up against the dirty glass, and a sign. He couldn't read it yet, but he didn't need to read it to recognize what was written all over the girl's face. He'd seen that exact expression before on the faces of civilians, caught in places they never should have been, in eyes that had seen the worst the world had to offer and were begging silently for someone to make it stop. Pure animal fear. The kind you couldn't fake. The kind that didn't lie. Wyatt twisted the throttle and closed the distance. The words swam into focus. Kidnapped. Help. For one heartbeat, the whole world went quiet. The engine, the wind, the riders behind him, all of it fading to nothing. And then Wyatt Hunter did something he hadn't done in a long, long time. He felt his blood go hot. On me, he barked, throwing his left arm out in a sharp signal his men knew by heart. All of you on me now. The riders behind him tightened up instantly, no questions asked. That was the thing about men who'd spent their lives in service. When the call came, they didn't waste a single second asking why. Riding closest to Wyatt's left was Mason Reed, a barrel-chested former firefighter who'd pulled more people out of burning buildings than he could count. He pulled up alongside, his weathered face creased with concern. "What have we got, Wyatt?" "Van, dead ahead." Wyatt's voice was flat and hard. "There's a girl in the back. She's writing for help." Mason's head snapped toward the van, and Wyatt watched the same cold realization wash over his old friend's face. "You sure?" "I looked her in the eye, Mason." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "I'm sure." That was all it took. "Cold blown," Wyatt shouted over his shoulder. "Get on the phone, get the law out here, mile markers, everything. Tell him we got a possible abduction to cargo van, no rear plate, eastbound." Cole Bennett, a retired long-haul trucker who knew these highways better than the back of his own scarred hands, already had his phone out. 30 years of driving meant he could rattle off road numbers and exits in his sleep, and he was doing exactly that, shouting their position into the phone with the calm of a man who'd handled emergencies before. "Jake," Wyatt called to the youngest of them, "stay on my wing. You do not do anything stupid, you hear me? You're 24 years old and your mama would kill me." Jake Lawson, a wiry young mechanic with more nerve than sense, flashed a grim nod. "Right behind you, boss." And just like that, a charity ride for a sick little girl became something else entirely. Inside the van, Travis Boone still hadn't noticed. He was hunched over the wheel, eyes flicking to the side mirrors, only to watch for police cruisers, never thinking for 1 second that danger might come rolling up on 2 wheels instead of 4. He had no idea that a wall of leather and chrome was closing in behind him, drawn by the one thing he'd been too arrogant to check. His prisoner had found a voice. Emma watched it all unfold through the back window, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. The riders weren't slowing down. They weren't peeling off. They were coming, fanning out across the highway, the older one in front, carving a path straight toward her, his eyes locked on hers like a promise. And for the first time in 2 hours, the despair in her chest cracked open and let something else through. It wasn't safety. She wasn't safe, not yet, not even close. It was hope. She pressed her forehead against the dirty glass, the sign still clutched in her trembling hands, and she let the tears come now because she finally could. "Somebody's coming." Somebody finally came. She mouthed 2 words at the gray-bearded man on the motorcycle, the same 2 words she'd written, but this time aimed straight at the one person who'd answered them. "Help me." Wyatt Hunter read her lips through the glass, and he nodded, slow and certain, a vow passing between a frightened stranger and a man who had long ago decided what kind of person he was going to be when the moment came. "I've got you," that nod said. "I've got you, and I am not going to look away." Up front, Travis Boone finally glanced in his side mirror, and the color drained out